in, I don't know, what, 15, 20 minutes, so we're going to try to do this. And to try to make it easier, I did make a PowerPoint, because sometimes if you're like me, you're a visual. It helps to be able to see it too, as well as hear it, and then it sticks. Why I like the history is because then it makes the other parts make so much more sense. There's a lot of things in the New Testament that leave us scratching our head a little bit. And if we know what's going on in that time frame, if we know what had just happened prior, it makes everything come to life. How many people here have heard about the 400 years of silence? Or is that a new term? The 400 years is the time between Malachi and Matthew, the New Testament. That's those 400 years where God no longer talked through any of the prophets and nothing more was written down. And that is why it is called the 400 years of silence. Now, with the help of Ray Stedman's nice and neat research, it's helped me kind of compact this a little bit here. But what I wanted to start out with is that at that particular time in the Old Testament, during Malachi, Babylon, how many people have here heard Babylon? Very, very prominent. They were the world power, okay? But something happens right here at that 400 years. There is a shift. There is a big, big shift. Israel is back again in the land of Palestine, and Babylon has now captured them, and they're the great world power that day. And it was the Persian and Medo-Persian Empire. Now, in Jerusalem, the temple had been restored again, although it was much smaller than the building that King Solomon had built. And within that temple, the line of Aaronic priests, which is the line that comes all the way down from Aaron, this is from Moses, they were still worshiping and they were still carrying on the sacred rites as they had been ordered to do so by the law of Moses. Now, what happened in these 400 so-called silent years after the last inspired prophet spoke and the first of the New Testament writers began to write is what a lot of people want to know. Well, God has long been preparing for the birth of Christ. And some of the most exciting preparations actually took place during this time of the so-called silent years. However, you will understand, as I said, the New Testament is so much better if we see what transpires now. In 435 BC, this is over 400 years before Christ is born, the prophet Malachi ceased his writing, and the center of the world power begins to shift from the east to the west. See, up to this time, Babylon had been the major world power, but this was soon to be succeeded by the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, Persia, if people remember, is where Esther was from. Okay, so they're kind of close, and they've been back and forth. So now Persia is about to take over. And at the height of the Persian power, there arose a country of Macedonia, which is now called Greece. That's right, you got it. And a man by the name of Philip Macedon, he united the islands of Greece, and his son was destined to become the great world leader of all time. And do you know who that person was? That's right. It was Alexander the Great. I'm sure everybody remembers him from history class. That was 330 BC. And there was a tremendous battle between the Persians and the Greeks, entirely altered the course of history. And in that battle, Alexander, as a young man, he was only 20 years old. Try to wrap your mind around that. Here's a 20-year-old man who has now conquered, basically, the world. He led the armies of Greece in victory over the Persians. He completely demolished the Persian power. And so now the center of the world power then had shifted farther west into Greece, and the Grecian Empire was born. Now here's the sad part. When Alexander the Great, what people don't know, when he was just 33 years old, he actually drunk himself to death. He had lost his only son, and he was so grieved over the fact that he had conquered everything and there was no more worlds to conquer that he went into unbelievable depression and killed himself. Think about that for a minute. Here is a man who had it all. He had all the fame, he had all the wealth, he had all the power. He was literally ruler of the world in his eyes. And he was so depressed because he still was not happy. All the things of this world could not fill the hole in his heart. So, since there was no heir, the world was divided into 4 generals. Now, if you read the prophecies of Daniel, if you get into Daniel, he talks so much about these 400 years. He was able to give an accurate, detailed account of the highlights of the conflict between the king of the north, which is Syria, and the king of the south, which is Egypt. They're just kind of coming back around, aren't they, in the news? That's who we're hearing about, Syria and Egypt and Russia. Yep. During this time, the Grecian influence was becoming strong in Palestine, and a party rose up among the Jews called the Hellenists. Now, they were eager to bring the Grecian culture and thought into the nation to liberalize some of the Jewish laws. Now, this forced a split between 2 major parties. There were those who were the strong Hebrew nationalists who wanted to preserve everything according to the Mosaic order. They resisted all foreign influences, and they were coming in to disrupt the old Jewish ways. The problem was they took that zealous for maintaining the laws of God and tradition so far radical that they became, as Jesus always called them, stiff-necked, unchanging, stubborn. He had the harshest words for the Pharisees. And the word Pharisee literally means to separate. They pulled themselves away. They insisted on preserving the traditions, and they grew stronger and stronger, becoming more legalistic and rigid in their requirements. Now, on the other hand, the Hellenists, the Greek lovers, became more and more influential in the politics of the land, and they formed a new party that you hear Jesus talk about in the New Testaments a lot, and that is the Sadducees. And believe it or not, they were the liberals. All right, but the thing with the Sadducees is, though, they turned away from the strict interpretation of the law, but they did not believe in anything supernatural. Well, how can you believe in God if you don't believe in the supernatural? And they did not believe in the resurrection. Now, there was a young Jewish rebel priest. Now, get this. He's a Jewish priest, and he does the unthinkable. He marries a Samaritan woman. And on top of it, he goes down to Samaria, and in rebellion against the Jewish law and the Pharisees, he builds a temple on Mount Gerizim, and it became a rival temple of Jerusalem. As you can about imagine, this caused about the most intense fanatical rivalry between the Jews and the Samaritans. So not only were they half-breeds, but now they had their own temple as well. Did not set well. Now also during this time, the Hebrew Scriptures were translated for the first time into another language. That was about 284 BC. A group of 70 scholars was called together by, get this, an Egyptian king. An Egyptian king wanted the Hebrew Scriptures translated into Greek. Around 200 BC, a new king, it says, who was the vilest ever recorded, did the unthinkable. In fact, he is often called the Antichrist of the Old Testament, since he fulfilled some of the predictions of Daniel. He persecuted the Jews, and his first act was to depose the high priest, read all of them, kill him, thus ending the long line of succession beginning with Aaron. So from the very beginning of Moses, we have had that line, that lineage, the whole time until right now, about 200 BC. In 171 BC, Antiochus invaded Egypt, and once again, Palestine was caught in the rivalry. He invaded Palestine. He killed over 40,000 people in just 3 days. and he forced himself into the Holy of Holies. Now, for those of you who know your Bible, the Holy of Holies is that section in the temple that was reserved only for God. When it talks about the curtain of the temple being ripped in two at Good Friday, this was the curtain that sectioned off that Holy of Holies. And only one priest, who was chosen by lot, got to go into the Holy of Holies, offer incense and prayers. And as we're going to see next week, how many people know who that priest was that got chosen? It was Zechariah. So this man goes into the Holy of Holies, the most sacred spot, and just to rub it into the Jews' face, in absolute word of their thought, he took a pig, and offered it upon the sacred altar. And then with the broth he made from the flesh of this unclean animal, he sprinkled everything in the temple, thus completely defiling the entire sanctuary. See, it's impossible for us to grasp how horrifying this was for the Jews. This was as bad as it could get. And it was this act of defiling the temple, which is referred to by the Lord Jesus as a desolating sacrilege, which Daniel had actually predicted. And this also became a sign of the coming desolation of the temple when the Antichrist himself will enter the temple. And he will call himself God, and thus defile the temple in that time. As we know it from the New Testament, that time still lies in the future. Now this is just some little fun facts. Did you know that Palestine is the most fought over country in the world? And Jerusalem is the most captured city in all of history. It has been pillaged, ravaged, burned, and destroyed more than 27 times in history. Well, Daniel had also prophesied that the sanctuary that we talked about would be polluted for 2,300 days. That's 6.5 years before the temple was cleansed. And it was cleansed under the leadership of a man, now famous in Jewish history as Judas Maccabeus. He actually was one of the priestly line, with his father and 4 brothers, rose up in revolt against the Syrian king. How many people have ever heard of the lost books of the Bible, or the Apocrypha, or people will say the Catholic Bible? The Apocrypha are most of these books that were written during these 400 silent years. And the Maccabees, there's actually about 4 books of them, and it talks of this account of them coming in, and they were the minority, they were the underdog, they were the little bitty group against the enemy, and yet God was with them, and they prevailed. And they took Jerusalem back, and they cleansed the temple, and they named the dedication, which happens to be on the 25th day of December. And on that date, the Jews still celebrate the Feast of Dedication each year. Now, it was during this time that the Maccabees began a line of high priests again for about the next 3 or 4 generations. However, after this time, it was just one of the priests who sought out protection from someone other than God. If you read the Old Testament, you will see this over and over and over. There'll be 3 generations that did good in the eyes of the Lord, and then there'd be one that would be evil. Or it'd flip around, and there'd be 4 that would do horrible in the eyes of the Lord, and there'd be one that tried to redeem Israel. Well, you have the Maccabees who came after all these years. They redeemed Israel. And it took just one guy, and what did he do? He sought out protection. He didn't even ask God to help protect him. Nope. He started taking matters into his own hands, and he signed a treaty with the Senate of Rome, providing for help in the event of a Syrian attack. And though this treaty was made in all earnestness and sincerity, this pact was introduced Rome into the picture of the history of Israel. And a battle raged And the Roman Emperor Pompey, he came down from Damascus. How many people remember Damascus? That's where Paul met God on the road to. And he entered the city of Jerusalem, and he overthrew the city, and he captured it for Rome. Does it start to make a little sense? You had Israel again as their own nation until they sought Rome for help. And Rome came in, and they conquered it. And so now we are at about 63 BC. From that time on, Palestine and Israel was under the authority and power of Rome. Now Pompey and the Roman Senate appointed Antipater as a procurator of Judea, a descendant of Esau. And he in turn made his 2 sons kings of Galilee and Judea, and the son who became the king of Judea is known as Herod the Great, who was a descendant of Esau. Now see, we're getting really close to Jesus' time, aren't we? And here we have a man who is a descendant of Esau, not of Jacob, and Jacob was the line of Israel. Rome has come in. See, there's that conflict, that back and forth. And it is because of the man who was named head over the area that his son became the king of Judea. And it was Herod the Great, the very one who sought the life of Jesus when he was born. Now at this time, the temple is still the center of Jewish worship, although the building has been partially destroyed and rebuilt about a half a dozen times. That's 6 times already since the close of the Old Testament. But now the synagogues have sprung up, and in every Jewish city seem to be the center of Jewish life, actually more so than the temple. And at this time, the people of Israel were split into 3 major parties. 2 of them, as we said, were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They were much more important. But there was a third one who was called the Essenes, which many scholars believe is actually the lineage or the line that Jesus and his family were more from. They were in great prominence in our times because they stowed away some very important documents in a cave. And those documents were brought into light by an accidental discovery of a young Arab boy in 1947, 1 year before Israel became a nation, and those were known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it was the line of the Essenes that had hidden those Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, our theme this year is puzzle pieces, and how do all the pieces fit together? I like this picture because I see a correlation between the very first fall of man and the coming of Christ. Both felt like they had lost everything. Both felt like God was silent because they had totally messed things up. And yet God was still holding all of us in the palm of his hands. See, the Jews had gone through times of pressure, and they had failed in their efforts to reestablish themselves, and they had given up all hope. And there was a growing air of expectancy that the only hope they had left was the coming of the promised Messiah. In the East, the Oriental empires had come to a place where wisdom and knowledge had passed or disintegrated, and they too were looking for something. When the moment came when the star rose above Bethlehem, the wise men of the East, who were looking for that answer to the problem, saw it immediately, and they came out to seek the one it pointed to. Thus, when the time had fully come, God had sent forth his Son. It is amazing how God utilizes history to work for his purposes. Though we are living in the days that might be termed the silence of God, when for almost 2,000 years there had been no inspired voice from God, we must look back, even as they did during those 400 silent years, upon the inspired record, and realize that God had already said all that needed to be said through the Old Testament and the New Testaments. See, God's purposes have not ended for sure. He is working with them out as fully now as he did in those days. Just as the world has become a place of hopelessness then, and the one who would fulfill all their hopes came into their midst, so the world again would be facing a time when the despair, is spreading widely across the earth. The world is only falling apart. At least so it appears from our standpoint. We find ourselves crying out to God, "Where are you?" in the silence. Hopelessness is rampant everywhere in this time. But God is moving to bring fulfillment all the prophetic words concerning the coming of his Son again into the world to establish his kingdom. How long? How close are we? Who knows? But what God has done again, I guess I went too far. But what God has done again in history, he will do again as we approach the end of the silence of God.